Welcome to Day 3 of Building a Sustainable Future, Conversations with Alaskans. The focus of discussion today is closing the fiscal gap. Participants have spent the first part of the day in breakout groups tackling the challenge of how to balance the state's budget, including the use of some tools outlined in the last general session. Building a Sustainable Future, Conversations with Alaska is made possible with support from the State of Alaska Office of the Governor.
Welcome back to our online web audience and to all the participants. This morning, our 169 participants were in 7 breakout groups to discuss revenue issues and to develop revenue scenarios using the interactive economic model that was unveiled yesterday by the Department of Revenue. So what we're going to do in the next half hour or so is to briefly share how each of the 7 groups fared, and I'll ask the chairs and co-chairs of the groups to come up. And those chairs who are not already up to the front, if you could move up to the front. And I will begin with asking Karen Perdue to come up and report on her group.
Well, thank you. I've done a lot of challenging things in my life, but this might be one of the more interesting things to encapsulate a very rich conversation, a 4-hour conversation into 3 minutes, over issues that are not only near and dear to us as Alaskans, but also complex. So my group has given me license to try to be as simple as possible, understanding that these are very complicated issues. So our group did look at all the material that was provided to us and did vote on revenue-raising measures. We looked at, and we want to be clear that we thought we didn't have enough information, of course, to make final decisions, but to study taxes that and revenue-raising measures that we came up with about $1 billion to $1.6 billion in revenue-raising measures. Now, each one of those has a complexity to them, also a cost of collection, and that was a concern for the group. As we looked at these very smaller mechanisms that would raise relatively small amounts of money, how complex would that be, and what would the interactions between those revenue-raising measures be? But we weren't able to go to green, I guess is the point, in looking at the revenue-raising measures. We asked to be inserted in the model, $500 million in permanent spending reductions beyond the $800 million that's already been reduced. Commissioner Hofbeck came in and miracle made the model do that. That was very helpful. And then we turned our discussion to permanent fund earnings, and we had some experts, seasoned experts in the room, and I think our views were that the permanent fund earnings and perhaps portions of the inflation proofing do need to be seriously looked at to close the gap. There's really very little other way to do it. And the permanent fund earnings could come in 2 different ways, or the permanent fund draws. One would be, as I said, the earnings, a portion of the earnings. Another would be to review the inflation proofing criteria and only use those mechanisms in times of need. So if the price of oil increased, or if we had a gas line, we would use that as a temporary measure to fill our holes. We do understand the very intense need to work for the gas line. The model shows in 2027 revenue coming in, and all attention obviously should be focused on that. So this concept of a bridge to that period, if we can reasonably assume that, would be a way to go about this philosophy of discussing with the public that we have to take extraordinary measures, and we will evaluate this on a periodic basis. We also were concerned about any mechanisms that would be so complex that they would bog down the ability for the legislature and the governor to act. Whether those are constitutional issues or other things. So trying to streamline the approach to an approach where the legislature, through a majority, and the governor, in working together, could accomplish these within a shorter period of time. We also believe that there is still tremendous confusion among the public about oil taxes and production credits. We were not experts in that for the most part. So we did have some good discussions, but we were not really able to evaluate as a group those issues. And we feel that that continuation of education is vital. Additionally, to the extent we do anything with the permanent fund that affects the value of the dividend, we feel that it's important to communicate to the public about their individual dividend. For instance, you could have a situation potentially where you're tapping into $10 of someone's dividend value, and for that they are getting schools, highways, public safety, et cetera, basic services. So to really bring this down to an individual level seemed really important. So Governor, and Lieutenant Governor, that's our report. I hope I accurately reflected it, and it was really an honor to be able to participate in this activity.
So I'm taking the groups in different order than yesterday just to mix it up a little bit. I'll ask Dennis McMillian and Aaron Harrington to give a report from their group.
This time, please listen to what she says.
I just want to start off by thanking Margot, Griffith, and Suki, I believe it's Miller, who were our facilitator and scribe for the last few days, and they've been marvelous, and I think we had a really strong team in combination. I also want to thank our group. We had an awesome group. We had really great conversations. We started off by burning the dots. So I apologize to those of you who are in charge of keeping a permanent comparable record because we totally messed you up. Like the last group, we determined right up and early on that we had to do additional cuts, and we chose 10% as our starting point. And the reason that we did that, and it resurfaced throughout our many hours of conversation, is that we believe that for a lot of reasons, political reasons having to do with Alaskans' willingness to come to the table, with businesses' willingness to come to the table, but also with the realities of our situation and our partnership, if we want to call it that, with the legislature, that we have to be very, very serious about signaling that we're not, that we are expecting reductions and that we are taking them on. So 10% additional reductions. We also made an assumption that we needed to have a functional capital budget. So early on, we set that at $150 million. We later increased it to $300 million. So those are two pretty important assumptions that stayed with us throughout the course of our conversation. I'm not going to get into all of the exact details of all of the little numbers that we turned on the dial. Know that we did experiment with industry taxes like fishing and mining taxes. We put an income tax on the board. We put a sales tax, a statewide sales tax on the board. Healthcare taxes. We talked about the risks and benefits associated with things like arbitrage for PERS and TERS. They were great conversations. A lot of values conversations, a lot of really interesting stuff came up. In the end, we must work with our permanent fund as an asset. And I think that in the end of our conversation, one of our participants really wrapped it up well, which is that we're not talking about the shortcomings that we have as a state. The frame for this is the assets that we have as a state as we navigate this difficult time, and the permanent fund is a very, very significant one. So for us, that meant permanent fund and an endowment model. We did a 70-30 split. There's certainly other splits, but 70 to government, 30% to dividends. We think that that message is a really important responsibility that all of us need to carry out of here. Beyond that, we are concerned about leveraging some of our assets through the arbitrage, also through the borrowing against the permanent fund, essentially playing the market, because they are our assets. They're the core of what has the potential to make us strong or not. And we don't want to put them at risk, even though we recognize that as financial tools, they could bring us some immediate benefit. They could also really cause some devastating consequences. I think most importantly, all of us are going to walk out of the space with 30 people that we had really valuable, respectful, engaged conversations with from very different sides of the table, literally, figuratively, and otherwise. And we all feel that we have an important voice in carrying this message forward. So I look forward to the part of the day where we're charged, as I believe that we will be, with doing something on behalf of the state and behalf of this administration. But I think in all, our group feels that we had a very valuable conversation this morning. And thank you, Dennis.
Let me turn now to Robin Brenna.
Good morning, all. Can you hear me in the back okay? All right, thank you. Several points. First, the variety of opinion in the room was fascinating, a very broad range of opinions, and in a short amount of time to deal with it. And so I appreciated, and I think everyone appreciated the variety of opinion and the respectful way in which those opinions were shared. Our group too felt, but we didn't come in and have someone tinker the model for us, that before you can credibly go to revenue-generating options, you have to be sure that your government is operating lean and mean, and that we want to be assured that government is operating as cost-efficiently as we can. And so that was an underlying theme that I think that there was consensus on in the room. The other issue that came up was the amount of distrust that exists between different stakeholders in the process, and the need to get information, to have policy-driven decisions based on accurate information. There was a couple times when it came up that the lack of information and how that information could be better filled. If you're going to be making these kinds of major policy decisions, I think we felt that there should be a tremendous effort to provide specific and helpful information into the policy consequences. With regard to, we sort of discussed this in three categories: the permanent fund, the oil industry, and new taxes on others, and felt that, I mean, my sense was that everyone has to contribute for us to move forward. Specifically, we had 16 people in our discussion group. The vote was 14-0 for an income tax, which kind of surprised me, but that was the vote. And I think some of the logic behind that vote is it's time for Alaskans to have some skin in the game. Now, I'm not defending that, but that was 14 positive votes and no votes. To make Alaskans have some skin in the game with regard to the size of their government. And what we put in there was one of the toggles in the model, which would put it at 15% of the federal tax liability amount, is the amount that we thought was the appropriate amount. The second most popular vote was 7 for and 2 against. The only one of these revenue sources that there was votes against was on the permanent fund earnings. And we looked at the permanent fund earnings, and we thought that I think as a group that they needed to contribute to the process. We didn't go with the endowment method. We used a 50-50 split, and we raised about $1.4 billion in that process and about $600 million through the income tax. And what we did as a process is we went through, based on the number of green dots at each potential revenue source, and we went through and we toggled the model and discussed each one in turn. So that was 1 and 2. There was 2 that were 5. One was the North Slope reimbursable credits that people felt should be reduced, and that was a 5-0 vote. And the other was the base rate for taxes. The base rate for taxes, currently it's 35% of profit, and we talked about 40 and 45%. We ultimately ended up at an increase to 45%. and we ultimately ended up with about $2.7 or $2.8 billion in additional revenue. We were $250 million short, and we thought that with $10 billion in savings, a $250 million shortfall gave us a soft landing through the issue. We went past those four into mining taxes was 3-0, and people felt that other industries should be paying more closer to their fair share. There was some sense that the oil industry, we've been heavily reliant on the oil industry, and some of these other industries may not have been paying a share. We went down to the 2-0 revenue sources as well, which were the sin taxes and motor fuel taxes. And so we went literally through every revenue source, toggled every toggle we could, and we ended up with about, like I said, $2.7 billion in new revenue, about $250 million short. We started to go back in to try and get our model to go green on us, but we decided that $250 million short was a good compromise for us. It was a fascinating process to go through. Thank you for the opportunity to go through it. And I look forward to the conversation to come.
Can I invite April Ferguson up to give a report for her group?
Thank you. And I don't know if this is being streamed or televised for, so those folks who may be out there online, this is a very free-flowing exercise with a number of very knowledgeable citizens who are willing to spend their time on a weekend to sit down and try to come up with some solutions for the state. And I would encourage everyone to, again, use this model and play with it. It's very illuminating, and I want to add myself to the category of concerned citizens. I am not an expert by any means in this, and the challenge for me is to so our group worked up right until 5 minutes to 11, so to synthesize everything that came out of there is really not possible, especially because the conversations were all over the board, but I have a series of comments that people made that I think are illuminating, and I also think that much of what you heard from the previous groups was echoed in ours. And we did take our vote, though, with the green dots, and that's where a lot of the focus of our discussion was. So the budget items, such as state lotteries, had a lot of red dots on it. We didn't go there. We spent times on other areas, and so I'm going to be patient. I'm going to run through some of what we discussed here. So one of the first comments that somebody made was we really should be looking, instead of the next 30 years, let's look at the next 5 to 10 years, because like any strategic plan, we're going to come back and revisit this. So try to fix what we can and our goals over shorten up the graphs. Our goals should be immediate goals that we're going to revisit. One of the interesting and very curious things to come out of the group interaction is that people are able to change their minds based on the information that they're getting. So we discussed the PFD and the different methodologies, and after folks looked at what was happening with the graphs and they listened to their fellow citizens, and I will say there's no partisanship in any of this. People were searching for answers. They were passionate about some things, but they were speaking with each other. So after reviewing, say, for instance, the impact that the PFD cap would have on the various charts and the endowment fund, it was taken off the table. Whereas there were a number of people in favor of it in the beginning, that one was taken off the table because they were also weighing not just what would affect the state's budget, but the real impact or the difference it would have in people's lives. And I just was very encouraged by that, is that we're all able to, based on sufficient information, change our point of view. a lot of the categories seem to have a very incremental effect. So, and I know other groups have noted that, the mining tax and others, but nevertheless, we went through those because the idea was, as small and incremental as they are, when you're dealing with the budget, you've got to go through every item. There were cautions, be careful about the impact on business. We want business to be successful and we want to support industry's growth. Let's see. Another wonderful thing for me is buried throughout all of the comments, everybody in the group, it seems to me, there was a consensus that education needs a steady stream of income directed towards the schools. And how are we going to capture that from everybody who's up here working? There was support for Senator Bishop's SB 97 bill that is on the table. And again, if it's somewhat disjointed here, my notes are also, but there was a little bit of discussion surrounding that. Sales tax potential, and also, some discussion is how do we capture income from out-of-state workers? How can we do that in a constitutional manner? So there's a commuter tax recommended. Let's consider or look into that. Sales tax, the cost of a tax, and there was, like a former group, is the cost, trying to weigh the cost of implementing some of these programs relative to what are we really going to get on that, and what is going to be the impact on the people of the state. 3, 4. So an interesting suggestion that, again, following on education, why not an educational endowment fund that take $5 million estate lands, put it into this endowment fund, and have it managed similar to the mental health trust. Throughout the whole hour, lots of regrouping back to how do we search for a consistent stream of revenue for education. Another thing I thought was very encouraging is that it's not this group working on this problem. I think that people around the state are doing it. Diane Kaplan was in our group, and she says that the Rasmussen Foundation has convened a group, I think of them as a think tank, that are coming up with these kind of discussions also. And I hope that each one of you will find her later and get a fuller description of what it is they're doing. Part of this was to possibly split the PFD in half, with one half of it going towards education. Some of the discussions surrounded creative ways to use the savings we have, borrowing against the savings we have, caution against government playing with money. The PFD, it was noted, and this goes back to participants, having a position but then willing to change it, sometimes immediately or years later. The participant who was originally against the PFD, but realizing now that it provides a cash economy in rural areas, supporting subsistence, and that PFD fund also has a huge multiplier effect in the state's economy. That was countered in some part by another participant going, well, in my demographic, it fuels the meth industry. And and these are actual things, we need to consider. So the further out from the hubs, the more important the PFD becomes. Caution to slow down development, long-term development. Let's think about possibly interstate community grouping, inter-community ties, and being more effective with the infrastructure that we're building. Lastly, like looking at different pots of money. There seems to be huge Alaska Housing Finance Corporation portfolio. Do we need as a state to be in the banking business? Look at other pots of money that the state has to see if these could be better utilized. This in no way captures the breadth or depth of all of the conversations that our group has, and my apologies to our group for that. There were a lot of experts in the room, and I wanted to thank our group, James Gilchrist and Will Bishop, Claire Ross. James was our scribe, and I'm hoping that the notes that he took can somehow be put on the line underneath some of these revenue categories, you'll get a little fuller picture of some of the comments that people made. But thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thanks, April. Liz Medicine Crow.
Good morning. I want to first start by saying Gunesh Chish Hawa to Governor and Lieutenant Governor and to all of your incredible cabinet and staff for pulling this together so that as Alaskans, or at least Alaskans that are in the room, since there's lots that aren't here, we have an opportunity to share some ideas with you as you struggle with this enormous task. I also want to thank our facilitator, Doug, our revenue resource, Mike, and our scribe, Chris, for their hard work, especially because it is a lot of work going back and forth between all of the different options. So I want to start first with this bad mamma jamma, and start by prefacing these comments by referring to the screen behind me. It says, building a sustainable future for Alaska. And one of the things that I think from a meta level that was really impressive to me about our group is that they were willing to play with the model and know that despite a lot of toggling back and forth and trying to figure out how things impacted and essentially pouring water back and forth between glasses to see what we could come up with, at the end of the day, look at all the revenue options we actually have. If you step back from just planning in the red, which is where a lot of our conversation was, there's actually a lot of black that we should be considering in terms of what a sustainable future for Alaska looks like. So just to kind of go through this really quickly, what our group did, we got to green. And we got to green by having a permanent fund dividend cap at $12.50. We had a minimum, we modified the oil and gas taxes with a minimum tax at 10%, a GVR, the new oil tax reduction, natural gas reserves tax, North Slope reimbursable credits, per barrel credit, mining tax at 5%, an income tax at 15%, a sales tax at 2%, and a state lottery. So in that process, and it was not an easy rendering to get there, and by no means would I say that that was something we voted on and everyone was like, yeah, that's great, let's go with that. But rather in the experience of the model, being able to grapple with the consequences of what happens when we change any of these different levers, and being able to get to a point to see that, yes, actually we can meet the revenue gap that's been presented. When we first got started, we had identified that the permanent fund endowment wasn't actually on the list. And so our group fixed that and then shared that information with the other groups. We had a conversation about the price per barrel and decided that taking a conservative number and approach was much better for us in the long term, setting that at $60. We had a discussion about valuing the services, which was all day yesterday, and then coming into actually having to plug the gap. And especially in an environment where our major revenue generator is so unpredictable and getting more so. We also talked about, there was also an interesting conversation about having too much surplus. Yeah. That was actually the point that was raised, too much surplus, and then the counterpoint was, well, then that gets us to a position where we are right now, but now we can actually plan for that. So we don't breed in bad habits moving forward because now we're aware of them and we can actually plan for that. In the experience of placing the dots, when it came to the things that were kind of politically controversial perhaps, an income tax, on the income tax line there were 6 green dots and 4 red ones. On the sales tax, 2 green dots and 2 red dots. And then on the property tax, 4 red dots and 2 green dots. We decided at that point that we were going to add in everything that had a green dot and then subtract out all the ones with a smaller amount of dots before we actually got to dealing with the red dots. And that helped us move from a place of really starting to get sticky over each of the different line items or options and move to a place of actually being able to see how the model would work if we were willing to play with it. Another point that was raised actually in the conversation was to ensure that we don't forget that this is not a vote, that this is in fact a model and it's an exercise and it's an opportunity to see what we could come up with rather than feeling as if we were making decisions today about the future, and it really helped people free up. Some of the concerns that were raised were about impacts on regular people. I think that was something that was mentioned yesterday as well, and I think the comment yesterday was it's a room full of haves making decisions about have-nots. And so there was a concern about regular people. There was a concern about the impact on municipalities, concern about our rural communities and the impact on lower income families. There was an issue of trust as well. There was some trust about the role between governments in the state. One of the cautions that was mentioned, and you're going to be surprised at this, politics. The question was asked, are there any political dead on arrivals in this model? And the response was, every box. Another concern that was raised was about the disparity of the cook inlet taxes, currently having to be made up by the state, which is great for South Central, but causes a disparity for everybody else around the state. There was a conversation about the consequences of SB 21 and the impacts within the model itself. So some of the technical aspects of the model, some of the issues that were run into, and I think that they're going to continue to refine the model so Alaskans can play with that some more. And another concern was identified, and that's that there needs, let me see if I can read my writing, that there's a clear need to incentivize new production in Alaska. And one last point, in terms of toggling between the different options, there was an impact with gaming and the lottery because of where we were in the model. And a concern was raised over whether a study or any studies have been launched into the impact of a lottery on how that would carry over into the charitable gaming receivers, tribes, nonprofits, et cetera. And then instead of kind of diving further into that, we went into toggling between the mining tax and the lottery, and they had almost the equivalent impact based on where we were. So in short, it was a really great exercise. Our group was really willing to get into the process. On a personal note, it would be wonderful to be able to see what other Alaskans, especially our brothers and sisters out in rural Alaska and in our villages, what decisions they might make if they had the opportunity to sit with a resource, our revenue resource, and a facilitator to go through the process. I think that we might see substantially different kinds of analysis while at the same time increasing the knowledge for our decision makers. So, Ganesh Chishawa.
Jim Dodson and Tim Navarre.
After my performance yesterday, Tim's making me go first. So, and I'm limited. I can't really tell you anything that went on. Tim's going to tell you that. But one of the things I do want to do, because it was such an amazing tool, Commissioner Huffbeck and his staff, thank you for putting that together. That really made this a very interesting process. And, you know, obviously, all of you felt the same way, but the team that we worked with, to the person, was very appreciative of the hard work that went into that. One more thing on behalf of our whole team, a big thank you to Pam and Brenda, the two people that worked with us. They put up with a lot of frustration, starts and stops, but in the end of the day, they got us out the door, and we did make decisions. And Tim's here to tell you about them. Tim.
Thank you. I have to put on my reading glasses. I'm 60 years old now, and so that's the way it works. Our committee, the first thing we did, we discussed a little bit, and one of the first things we wanted to make, even before we put the dots on the board, was to make sure and understand that the corpus of the permanent fund was not going to get impacted by anything we did on the model when we went to work, and we were assured that it did not affect the corpus of the permanent fund. And we went up and put dots on the board, and our top ones were the permanent fund earnings and the permanent fund dividend cap. The next two were income tax and natural gas reserve tax. And when we got done with all of that, we put those in there, and we're still a little short. And then we had more discussion. And again, as has been stated, Commissioner Hoffbeck and others in the room helped us. But you know, the natural gas reserve tax is borrowing against the future earnings. And after we had it in there, and even though it got us to the $3 billion, we took it out. And we went back to try to find and make some more adjustments. And I can report to you that we made it to green. We made it to $2,997,000. And that's as close to green as you're going to get, I think, from our group. It included the endowment at 5%, the permanent fund cap at $1,250. And on that, when you do the endowment and you use the 5% and you do the permanent fund dividend at $1,250, the cap, the projection of the permanent fund dividend for FY17 would be $1,050. It wouldn't get to the $1,250. It would take a number of years to grow it back to the $1,250. But it was a give and take on where you're at. But just so you hear that we tried to get it to the $1,250, and that there is a methodology, but then you have to give and take some others. But our method, I just want to make that clear, that was the case. We did collateralization of the revenues by 20%. And then we started getting into fuel tax. We actually wanted to go higher, but we raised it by 5 cents. It's still the lowest, or some of the lowest in the country. We were going to try to get to 18 cents, which would have raised about $60 million in revenue. But the flow chart at this time let us go up another 5 cents instead of 10 cents. We're currently at 8 cents. And then we added the income tax. We increased the maximum rate of corporate income tax 2%, and the personal income tax as a percent of the federal income tax liability was 15%. And then, like one of the other committees, at least I heard, the state lottery was added, and healthcare provider tax was added. And I also, our group kept in mind of where our savings account and where it lasted, and it went clear to balance out on this projection. Using up the savings over time got us to 2029. And so that's another thing that you have to watch on those charts to see how fast you use up the current savings that we have that have to cover some of the deficit going out until hopefully where everybody is hoping new revenues come in. As I stated, we didn't want to borrow against the natural gas reserve tax at this point and have to pay it back later. But when those come on, then there won't be any payback, and we can start using those for revenues. And so I hope I covered it. I'm going to be a little shorter. I know some of the others. I just want to thank, the governor's decision to bring us all together, I think, turned us back to the light at the end of the tunnel. I think all his commissioners and all the work they did that's been stated here earlier put working lights up, so we're headed in the right direction, and hopefully we'll stay on track. There's a lot of obstacles that they've pointed out and that you can see in this flow chart when you try to work it. But I think if all of us work together, that's all of the stakeholders, everybody in this state, we can get to the end of the light at the end of the tunnel this time, and there'll be bright days ahead for Alaska. Thank you.
And our final group, thanks for your patience, is Bob Williams and Mary Pete.
Hi, I'm Bob Williams, and it's great to be here. And you've seen a lot of presentations, and I know you've been waiting for the exact solution, and we have that, and we'll be sharing it momentarily. But I just want to think, I was thinking about what is probably one of the most significant, meaningful things that's happened here. And one of them was just, it wasn't that long ago, Gunnar had a quote in the paper saying, we're not having the conversations that we need to be having. And we have a governor, Governor Walker and Lieutenant Governor Byron-Malott, that are giving us the framework to have those conversations. And that's significant. And it is so cool that Governor Walker and Lieutenant Governor Byron-Malott are staying in the same dorms that we're staying in. I don't care who you are or how you're doing, we all have a better bed than that dorm room bed. And it's great. And to have a governor sit down and say, hey, I want to hear what you think about education. Or I went off to work on something and a whole bunch of high school students came, and then Governor Walker came down to share and listen again. And so to have that leadership that models the work that we need to do to come together as a team. And I also think one of the most significant things is what's even happening outside of the sessions. Yesterday I was heading back to my dorm thinking I'm going to eat my peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and there was an international economist, a nurse practitioner, an executive board member, a school board member, a parent advocate, and they're like, hey, why don't we go out to eat? And my car only holds 5 people. We packed 6 in. We went out and we had a great burger. We solved quite a few of Alaska's problems, but it was just a rich conversation. And once again, at the table next to us, Governor Walker was eating there, same place I'm having a hamburger. So that's awesome. This type of working together, it's one of those things that I'm so proud and inspired to be here and be a part of this. And one of the things that Mary Pete and I wanted to do in our session this morning is we wanted to honor that and make sure that we're empowering, engaging, and respecting the wisdom that we have in the room. So we chose a spokesperson to represent the learning that we did this morning. And the winner of that is Justin Roberts. Thank you very much.
So our group had a lot of discussion on a variety of different issues. We had a lot of different viewpoints and perspectives on how to deal with both revenue and spending side of the equation. We were far from consensus on any model. I think the closest to consensus we came up with was that this is a difficult problem and there's no easy solutions. In our initial voting with the green dots and the red dots, the top 3 categories were use of the PFD earnings and capping the dividend, income tax, and minimum oil tax. The least popular choices were the sales tax and property taxes. The other options we talked about were corporate income tax, healthcare provider tax, the motor fuels tax, state lottery, fisheries taxes, and other oil taxes. The model we plugged into the computer didn't quite get to a balanced budget, but it was really close by 2016. I think we were at 170 million off. But then the deficit goes back up to 1.5 billion by 2030. The model we plugged in was income tax at 15% of the federal liability, which closed about 15% of the gap. Use of 50% of the PFD earnings after a 4% endowment, which closed about 30% of the gap. 10% minimum oil tax, which closed about 15% of the gap. Capping the PFD at 1,000, which closed another 10%. We did a 10% spending cut in 2016, which closed another 15%. We did a 2% increase in corporate income tax, which closed 5% of the gap. We had a 3% healthcare provider tax, which was about 1%. A 5% increase in motor fuels tax, which was about 1%, and the state lottery, which was less than 1%. And I don't think it was a model that anybody liked or really ended up with a consensus that this is what we should do. I think there was an idea that we need a lot more discussion on the details and how to balance the revenue options and the spending cuts in a way that was fair to all groups. And so we talked about different income levels, rural versus urban, different industries and the impact on different industries. There were general questions about whether the model properly values things like oil tax credits going forward, whether additional cuts are possible, whether the model properly valued future oil prices. There was discussion on proper level for various revenue options. Comments about the need for a broad range of revenue options that are shared by individuals and across industries. We talked about the use of the PFD unduly impacting poorest Alaskans. Discussion of the impact that various taxes have on industry, investment, and production. We talked about the PFD generally being spent in-state and how cutting it might hurt rural Alaskans and money staying within the state of Alaska. We talked about the income tax and the fact that it brings revenue from seasonal and North Slope workers, as well as the impact that it has on Alaskans. And then we ended with a long discussion of natural gas reserves tax. We didn't get anywhere close to an agreement. And I think in general, we just had a variety of really strong views on pretty much every topic that we talked about. And at least I personally found it to be a fascinating discussion and to highlight some of the difficulties that we're going to have moving forward, the complexity on reaching a consensus and how we as a state can move forward as Alaskans. But I think the point that this all brings up is that that's a discussion that we have to start. Thanks.
Well, thank you, and I think that final report has maybe the one-line conclusion. This is a difficult problem, and there are no easy solutions. And I really appreciate the work and floating around to each of the groups, seeing the level of discussion. Clearly, this is a very engaged group, not just because you were here at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning, but because you really engaged in these issues. And one of the things I heard was people are really concerned about the impacts outside of state government as well. What does this do to the overall state economy? How does this impact jobs? How does it impact income disparity within the state, regional differences within the state? What does it do for housing values or personal income? And so I think as we carry this conversation beyond this room and out into the wider audience, we need to be thinking about what are those impacts in addition to trying to close a gap. How does it affect the quality of life in Alaska? Now, in order for there to be a little bit more conversation, the process from here, we're going to invite you to have lunch again at 9:49, but to come back, we have a set of tables and ask you to form groups of 6 to 8 people each at those tables, and the tables closest to the ballroom, and we're asking you to discuss 4 questions during that lunchtime. What are your takeaways from the closing the fiscal gap exercise? From a revenue standpoint, what's the first step we should take? How can we engage Alaskans, as many Alaskans as possible, in the conversation? And what are your highlights from this event? And there are forms on the tables for you to fill out. We'll ask you at each table to pick someone to give a 1-minute summary at the end of what you got from those 4 questions. Now, because we will start the live broadcast promptly at 1 p.m., we'd ask groups to start breaking about 10 of, get in your seats so that we're able to start and really communicate with all Alaskans about this. After we hear from the small groups this afternoon, we'll then wrap up the initial conversation. So again, thanks to all of you for the engagement this morning. Please enjoy your lunch.
You're watching Building a Sustainable Future, Conversations with Alaskans on 360 North and 360north.org, made possible with support from the State of Alaska Office of the Governor.